We all know the best thing about reading is not the entertainment or the empathy or the education, but the stats we get at the end of the year on Storygraph. Today I want to talk to you about my 2022 reading year in review. And then I also want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I learnt and some of the things that I want to do a little bit differently in 2023. That's both in terms of my reading, but also how I'm talking about my reading online. So I'm not exactly sure how many books I read in 2022. I logged 169 books on the Storygraph and I logged about 250 on GoodReads. Basically, I think I read roughly 150 books in my own time and then another 100 books or so at work, like picture books, things like that. I logged a couple of those at the beginning of the year on Storygraph. In the end, I wasn't logging those, but I still tried to log some of them on GoodReads, although I didn't log all of them there either. I don't know, my reading's a bit of a mess now that I'm a children's bookseller, but we're gonna go off the Storygraph stats mostly. So according to the Storygraph, last year I read 169 books and 43,774 pages, with an average book length of 267 pages. The first book that I read this year was Bruno, which is a junior fiction kind of comic style book that I'm still obsessed with. And the last book that I read was The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. Far and away the genre that I read the most of in 2022 was fantasy. If you've been following me, you'll know that I kind of stepped into my fantasy era last year. So this was very different from previous years where normally I was reading more literary fiction. The longest book that I read in 2022 was The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. That was 781 pages long. The shortest book that I read was just 17 pages. It's a short story. It's from the editorial page of the Folchester Weekly by Marie Brennan, which is the short story that fits in the Lady Trent memoirs series that I've been reading. Most of the authors that I read the most books from were mangakas. So like, you know, if I read multiple volumes within a series, that makes sense. So Jun Miyazuki and Rumiko Takahashi were the two that I read the most books from. I read 5 books each from those authors. They're the authors of After the Rain and Maisin Ikoku. Then I also read 4 books each from Kei Gaku, the author of Boys Run the Riot. N.K. Jemisin, although I did also start a 5th book, but I DNF'd that one. Marie Brennan, the author of the Lady Trent series. And Yuki Midori Kawa, the author of Natsume's Book of Friends. My average rating was 3.58, and these are the books that I listed as 5-star reads during 2022 on the Storygraph. It's funny, I do feel like 2022 was a little bit of a mid-year in terms of like the overall reading experience. But according to the Storygraph, I handed out a lot of 4 stars this year. Apparently 77 of the books that I read this year were parts of series, which I didn't realize it was so much, but I suppose because I was reading quite a bit of manga and fantasy, that does check out. The moods I was reading during 2023 were mostly emotional, adventurous, lighthearted, and reflective. 60% of the books were classed as medium-paced reads, 25% were fast, and 15% were slow. The length of the books that I was reading, 60% of those were under 300 pages, 37% were between 300 and 500, and just 3% was 500 pages or more. So that's just 5 books that were more than 500 pages. 3 of those were from Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. Then there's The Starless Sea and Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I do feel like this graph is a little deceptive. It says that 90% of the books that I read in print or like physical copy. 7% were audio, 4% were digital, so like e-readers. I did read an awful lot listening to an audiobook while I also had a book in front of me, and those I just listed as physical reads. But that was definitely a big part of my reading in 2022 that isn't really reflected in these stats. And just in case you were wondering, my favorite book of the year I think would be Open Water by Caleb Azamar Nelson, and my least favorite book of the year was definitely The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. I've already done my favorite books of the year. I separated them out into 4 videos. I did my favorite junior fiction, middle fiction, and young adult, and then I also did my favorite adult fiction of the year. So I'll leave a link to those in the description box below for you. I haven't yet done my least favorite books of the year, but let me know in the comments if you would like to see that. Okay, now let's talk about some of the things that I've been reflecting on and that I feel like I've learnt a little bit about myself in this past year, and the things that I'm going to maybe change up or do a little bit differently in 2023. So the first thing I want to talk about is star ratings and how I've been rating books. I've found that a little bit tricky this year. I do feel like my stats are a little bit skewed in that a lot of my 4-star reads I felt like weren't quite 4-star reads, but it felt a bit mean to give them 3 stars. And I also felt that way about some of my 5-star reads. Basically in the past I decided to do whole star ratings just because I thought that was simpler. It looks simpler and neater on a graph. And as someone who can be quite indecisive, I just felt like the fewer options I had, the better. And I think in past years where I have not read as much, that did work for me. But obviously the amount that I'm reading every year has been going up and up and up. And this year I read quite a lot of books. And so not always, but sometimes I was feeling the need for a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more nuance within my star ratings. So in 2023, I'm going to experiment with half-star ratings as well. My prediction is that there won't be a whole lot of like 0.5 or even 1.5, but I do feel like I'm probably going to utilize especially the 3.5. I feel like there's a lot of 3.5 books out there, but anyway, we'll have to wait until the end of the year to see. One of the other things that I've struggled with star ratings was just like how widely I'm reading, especially now that I'm a children's bookseller. I think I found it primarily tricky when I'm reading kids' books that like are fine and that I can definitely see a target audience for, and I could happily recommend them to a particular kid who I think would love it. But me as a reader, like it wasn't for me. I didn't enjoy it. A lot of those books I ended up just lumping into like the 3-star category because I didn't really know what to do with them. I think basically I've been sort of struggling with those books that I'm reading for work to be able to recommend them to people, primarily children, but a lot of my rating system is very like just gut feeling based. I don't have some like nice little core pile system or anything that I go through. I really just like have a feeling that it's a 4-star read or that it's a 2-star read, you know? So with books that I'm reading for work, not really for my personal enjoyment, like that has been tricky and I haven't really figured out how to navigate that. So I don't really have a concrete plan, but I suppose I just wanted to let you know here that I might not be rating all of the books that I read this year. And I think a lot of those will be children's books, whether that's junior fiction, middle grade, or YA. And that also leads me to how I do my wrap-ups. The last couple of years I've been doing like ranked reviews through my wrap-ups where I like divide it into star ratings. And I've always thought that was quite fun. I like that it's kind of like neatly organized like that. But again, the star rating system is an imperfect system, and sort of trying to force all of my reading into that has just proved a little bit tricky this year. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm planning to do, but I think I'm going to have to ditch that style of wrap up, and I think I'm going to just more focus on like reviewing the books for you without such an emphasis on the star rating. And obviously there are some middle grade and YA that I absolutely love and adore, so those ones I will still tell you in depth my personal thoughts and feelings. But I think for the books that I am more reading for work that maybe aren't for me as a reader, but I would happily recommend to someone who I think it could be for, I will talk about those books more in the way that I would talk about them at work. I might tell you a little bit what it's about and who I think it's for. I'll still tell you if I think a book is outright problematic or if I think it's like a masterpiece. But for those books that are just like good for what they are and are good for the reader that they're meant for, I think the way that I'm going to talk about them will change this year. Another thing that I found a little bit tricky sometimes this year was like balancing my reading between what I needed to read for work or what like I want to be reading for work to be better at my job, and like reading for pleasure and for me as like the reader that I am. I think sometimes I felt a little bit overwhelmed, and sometimes when I was reading more for me, I would feel like I wasn't doing enough for work and that I was falling behind and not doing my job as well as I wanted to. And other times when I was really focusing on reading kids' books for work, then I would just sort of feel a bit slumpy and like I wasn't really enjoying reading, you know? And I think in November, December, I actually discovered a solution, and it might seem very obvious to you, but that is giving myself a bit of a TBR or a to be read sort of pile for the month. In November, I made a video about like 18 books or so that I wanted to read by the end of the year. And I had like a little checkbox list on my notes app on my phone of those books. And so whenever I was going to pick up a book, I would like check that notes app list to sort of figure out like what was next, what was I going to be reading next. Now, as someone who is very much a mood reader, more set TBRs is something that I've always avoided. But I really enjoyed having a little bit of structure and a little bit of planning about what I wanted to read and what I wanted to prioritize. And I think the reason that worked so well for me in November, December is because at the time of creating that TBR, I was trying to think about kind of creating that balance for myself. And I remember when I first was writing out the books that I wanted to read, a lot of them were children's books, and I didn't have a whole lot of just like pleasure reading for myself in there. And so like I consciously decided which children's books were important for me to prioritize and replace the other ones with books that I wanted to read. And I don't know if I've mentioned already, but I am in 2023 a judge for the Readings Children's Prize, which means that there are books that I have to read. Whether I want to or not, there are books that I need to read in a certain time frame. And there are also books that I need to be careful about how I speak about publicly. Not that I need to lie to you about how I feel about them, but I just want to like tread carefully, I suppose, given, you know, my position in that judging panel. Anyway, that's another reason that I just have found having a little bit more structure and planning around what I'm reading and when really helpful. And so what I'm thinking I would like to do in 2023 is just to experiment with this TBR idea a little bit more. I know it's old news to everybody else, but it's new to me. And I do know from my experience in November and December where sometimes I did just want to read something different that I hadn't even thought about before. I will want to leave like some wiggle room for some complete mood reads. So I don't want to give myself overly ambitious TBRs. Basically the idea is that these TBRs aren't some set in stone, rigid like rules I must follow. Instead, they're a helpful guideline that I've sort of like considered my balance with my reading at the beginning of the month, that can like help me maintain that balance that I want in my reading. And another thing I've learned about my reading this year is my relationship to new releases. I've often said that I'm not much of a new releases reader. I like to let the community sort of sift through the difference between hype and like actually great books, and then like get into those books a little bit down the track. And I think that is a totally valid approach for my own personal reading. But for the children's books that I need to be selling, I do need to be prioritizing new releases. So I've got myself like a little bit of a guideline about the things that I want to be thinking about while I'm making TBRs. So let's talk a little bit about those. So for the books that I'm reading for my own personal enjoyment, I want to be prioritizing the books that I already own, the books that are already on my shelf. For these books, I also want to be prioritizing getting through some of the series that I have bought myself into in 2022. As I mentioned, for young adult and children's, I want to be prioritizing new releases, and that might mean borrowing a book from work rather than reading an old one that I've got on my shelf. If there's any books that I need to read for the Readings Prize, because I am a judge for the 2023 Readings Prize, I will have to prioritize that, as well as any books that I need to read for review. And then another thing I know about myself is that I really like having a mix of physical books and audiobooks. So finding a balance between those things is also important to me. And then speaking of audiobooks, I also want to try to make more room in my reading time for the Libro FM books I get every month through their ALC program. So I'm aiming to read one of those a month, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but I haven't always been doing that in 2022. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about prioritizing when I'm making my TBRs and experimenting with this new concept of TBRs in 2023. Another thing I want to try out in 2023 is rereading. I do not do very much of it at all. And although I don't want it to become like 20% of my reading or anything, I do want to make a little bit of time in my reading year in 2023 to read an old favorite. I think there would be so much joy in that. And I often say, like, I keep my collection the way that I do because I would like to reread some of my favorites one day. And I just haven't really made time for that before. So in 2023, I want to. I know the big goal that everybody wants to know is like, how many books you plan to read? What's your GoodReads goal for 2023? For the last couple of years, I've just put it at 100, and I've read quite a few more than 100 every year. So I'm just going to do the same this year. I'm going to aim for 100 because that gives me plenty of wiggle room if, you know, anything goes on in 2023, which, let's be honest, I'm sure stuff will happen. But 100 still feels like a really good solid number for me without pushing too hard at all. But of course, it's just a number. So even if I don't hit that, it's not the end of the world. Something else I'm trying out in 2023 is tracking my reading a little bit more in a detailed way with a spreadsheet. I got this spreadsheet on Etsy. I'll leave the details in the description box below. I sort of changed it up a little bit, although I'm not very confident with Excel or Google Sheets, so I try not to mess with it too much. But I think this will be an interesting way of just doing a little bit more detailed tracking of what I'm reading, and also the books that I'm borrowing from the many libraries I'm part of for audiobooks. As always, a pretty broad goal for me is to read widely, and I mean that in like as many ways as I can think of. I like to read widely in terms of genre, in terms of like where the book is from or where the author is from, where the book was published. The style of book, I love to read manga and graphic novels and novellas and like a whole range of things. I like to read from underrepresented communities. I just like to feel like my reading is like fairly broad. And I feel like I've been doing like a reasonably good job of that in the past couple of years, although there are a few things that I'll be tracking on my spreadsheet. Not everything, but a couple of things that I think will help me to see if that is like actually true. But thank you so much for joining me for like kind of my 2022 statistics and roundup, and a little bit of a look at what I hope for my reading in 2023. I would love to hear in the comments below if you have any particular goals around your reading or anything that you learned from 2022 that you want to switch up in the year to come. A big thank you as always to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon for supporting me and my channel. A big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown and Marie, who are my high tier patrons at the moment. Thanks so much for hanging out and watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.